there's just a twist. That normally traditional diplomacy is between governments, and here it's traditional diplomacy activities, but in interactions with private companies. And I think it is an absolute trend today, because the companies and the states are not in the traditional relationship of pure regulator-regulated. It's a more complex environment. Yes, there's still this dimension, and the GDPR, which is in everybody's mind at the moment, shows that regulation still does exist. And that, by the way, it has taken dimensions that are now quite different from what traditional exercise of sovereignty was, because extraterritoriality is not normally in the arsenal of traditional sovereignty. Traditional sovereignty is you do things on your territory, and the next country doesn't impinge on what you do, and you don't impinge on what they're doing, which is, by the way, very much the argument that China is developing in a very traditional sense regarding its regulation of the internet space. But coming back to what I was saying, the notion that today you get regulation that works in a slightly different way, through extraterritoriality, through the exercise of personal jurisdiction by courts over companies that are in other countries, there's a complementary dimension, which is that the companies themselves have a role that is not the traditional role of companies. And we have to be careful, because every time we say the companies, we just have a very limited number of them in mind. We all think about Facebook, Google, Twitter, Apple, and a few others maybe. But we completely leave aside an enormous range of other actors who are other types of intermediaries. They can be smaller, they can be at the technical layer. There was a very good panel on the domain name system and so on. So we have to be careful when we talk about interactions between governments and private sector, that we shouldn't be talking only about the very large platforms, although the main evolution is related to the interaction with the large platforms. And what I want to say here is that what I run is an initiative or a policy network called Internet and Jurisdiction, where the question fundamentally is the interaction between the cross-border internet and the applications it supports with the patchwork of national legislations. And I was discussing with one of the big companies 2 days ago, and they were taking issue in a certain way at the fact that I was saying, you as company are exercising jurisdiction in a certain way over your own territory. They said, no, we don't. We just have our terms of service, etc. Well, no. Jurisdiction in legal terms is 3 things: setting the norm, implementing them, and enforcing them. When you look at a large company like Facebook, like YouTube, and most of the big social media, they do those 3 things. They set the norms for their terms of service, at least that apply to their users. They implement them on a daily basis, and they adjudicate them in some cases. What is more interesting is that the trend today, whether we like it or not, is that the governments themselves, because they are bound by the rules of jurisdiction that should not bring them to exercise authority beyond their territory, are asking the companies to act on their behalf on the basis of their terms of service. When you look at the famous case of the right to be de-indexed, you get, and I've said that in other panels, so apologies for the repeating if somebody has already heard it. When you think in terms of legal framework, the notion that the highest court in Europe, the European Court of Justice, has entrusted a private company not based in Europe, i.e. Google, to do a first instance decision of the balancing of 2 fundamental rights of access to information and privacy, and that the appeal to that global first instance private decision is going back to the national level to a data protection authority, this is completely anathema with most of the architectures of the international system normally. This preamble, and I'm finishing with this, is just to illustrate that in an environment where we speak a lot about multi-stakeholder model and multi-stakeholder approach, norm setting implementation and enforcement is now becoming a shared distribution of responsibilities between the private actors and the governments in a way that honestly is completely in flux at the moment. And it's normal that it is in flux because it is really changing the, I would say, the astronomic landscape of things. To take an analogy with the Copernican revolution, you basically had only stars that were the governments and that were interacting and all the little planets were revolving around. And today you have this sort of massive amount of bodies that are not interacting through gravity, but that are interacting through direct relationships. And instead, and the typical example is one of the programs that we run, which is on cross-border access to user data in criminal investigation. We used to have a system that was very simple, yet a bit inefficient, which was the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. Without getting into details, if you are an investigator in one country wanting data from a company held by a company in another country, the US, MLA is you go to, as a police officer, you go to your Ministry of Interior, who passes it to the Ministry of Justice potentially and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who sends it to the State Department, which itself is sending it to the Department of Justice, which asks a court in the US to validate the thing, brings it back to the Department of Justice, gives an order to the company brings it back to the Department of Justice, makes a second analysis, and you get the order. That was the way it used to work. What is happening today is direct requests to the companies in frameworks that have no particular procedural order. So, long story short, the fundamental reason why all these initiatives are taking place, and as was said, I was based in Paris in a position that is now continued to participate in all international negotiations and so on. All countries, little by little, have established cyber diplomats in the ministries to deal with all the issues of international negotiations. And I think this trend of going towards the place where the thinking about the policy making is being made in the companies is a necessity. Whether this should be labeled as diplomacy, as multi-stakeholder interaction, as ambassadors, envoys, or so on, doesn't matter. The fundamental question is how do we develop more interactions between those different actors, because the problems we have to solve require that they talk to one another. And even if the companies have representations in the different countries, it's a completely different matter. It's all about dealing with the local presence of the company. And usually they hire people who are from the country to have the connections and the rules, which is very close to the diplomatic interaction that was in the case. So it's not that the companies are the equivalent of states, but the number of interactions require that there are new channels of interactions in what is now policy making in a shared responsibility.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. On this kind of direct avenue between the governments and the companies, also in the study we have kind of mapped, for instance, you see the data on the number of government requests for removal of content or for user data. It's publicly available information, and we have some maps in the study which do not quantify, but for instance show which countries one of these two requests came from, and you will see that almost all, well not almost all, but the vast majority of countries, some of them more actively, some less, really have this direct interaction. So, coming back to what I said at the beginning, governments do have stakes with the companies, but so also because of regulation and other challenges, the companies have stakes with the government. So we should in a way discover this art of conversation, as was also the title of this session. One important point that I should mention here, the fact that we do not have a private sector speaker among us was not an intention. But we are hoping that we will be able to have similar discussions also at a forum like this, including those that are kind of an important element when we are speaking about the dialogue. At this moment, I would rather like to go to you. If you have some questions, comments, reflections, or wanted to share your observations and your reflections on this topic, that would be great. And if you can briefly tell us who you are, please go ahead. Thank you.
So Nicole Gregory from UK government. So this is really, really interesting, and it comes at a good time because we As always, I guess you probably never stop looking at how you're doing the engagement. But just some kind of questions from kind of my perspective. So we do have somebody there, and we do it through the traditional model, the consul model. And likewise, as you described, we have a host of visits back and forth at all levels. And I guess that's my point. How do you, for example, under the kind of Swiss model, do the breadth? So if I think of in any given month in the UK, we will have probably, I could judge 5 to 10 different government departments who will be out talking to tech companies about anything and everything. So yes, on the business side, on the startup side, all the way through to intelligence and policing, through to the classic Home Office stuff, through to, how do you kind of cope with that level of breadth in the kind of policy space and expertise? Because what we've ended up doing is we do have somebody there, but we don't expect them to have that breadth. They have the contacts to help us do things, but we'd always get the domestic departments because it's so broad and so complicated. I think the other thing about it, just another question, is so again, the centre of gravity obviously is towards the Bay Area, but from our perspective as well, that can't be the only centre of gravity, because UK companies would have something to say about that, for example, if that was the only kind of dialogue we were having. So how do you kind of cope as well with making sure that's not the only kind of conversation that's being had?
Thank you, Nicole. And you're based...
I'm in London,
You're in
but in
London.
the Foreign Office.
Oh, but you're in
yeah. So I'm very, very interested. We genuinely, we are thinking about this now, so it's really, really timely.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Would we like to collect a few, or shall we go directly? Let's maybe quite free, and then we surely come back to your question, Nicole. Please.
Thank you. Thanks so much to the panel. It's very interesting. My name is Alana Openshaw. I work for a human rights organization called the International Service for Human Rights. We're based in New York and Geneva. It struck me that when you asked the room who was here, you didn't ask about civil society, and I wonder if that is indicative of the current conversation that's happening in the Bay Area. So I have a two-pronged question. The first one is understanding better how those who are operating from the diplomatic corps side in the Bay Area connect then those conversations with policymakers or representatives of governments in spaces like the UN and other international and multilateral spaces where policy is defined. So that's one question. And then the second question is, given what you're describing, if we imagine that this momentum towards situating diplomatic presence in where corporations is located will continue, then is it logical that civil society will also need to relocate? So will we have to follow you, as it were, to then be part of those conversations and attempting to influence outcomes?
Thank you. Alina, yeah? Did I get your name right?
Alina. Alina.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. Let's take one more if we want to. Oh, please, yes.
So I have a question about lessons learned from, obviously, your governments have done a tremendous amount of work here, but what lessons learned for governments of emerging market countries, frontier market countries that always, we would love to attract tech sector, they talk about wanting to build their own Silicon Valley, so just pipe dream here all the time, but short of being able to fly to San Francisco all the time, what can emerging market countries do to try to engage more robustly with the tech sector? What lessons from your experience apply?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So maybe now let's react. So first, there was Nicole's question from the UK. Joya, would you like to take that one or react to others as well? We can kind of put them together.
Yes, I can start with this one. It might be complemented by the actual diplomats, which I'm not. So we're a bit of an awkward beast, Swissnex, because we're really a bottom-up initiative, and we do get everything. We get everything from literally the individual researcher coming to look for a research partner or wanting to organize a symposium on something, and we help them do that with a local audience or local participants, all the way to actually government officials who come for whatever kind of foresight, right? And so we make all of those connections. We're sort of considered the platform that connects Switzerland to the Bay Area around this broad set of topics related to research to all the way to corporate innovation, let's say. And so we don't actually, we're not at the back end, we're really at the front end. So how this then flows back into policy is sort of beyond our control.
Okay.
What we have tried to do, because one thing that really happens in the Bay Area, and I think you would probably know what I'm talking about, is this is an area, and this reflects a little bit what you're saying, the question you're asking. The whole world travels there, literally. I mean, these companies, these institutions, they could do nothing but receive delegations from all over the world that want to either know what the secret sauce is to build your own Silicon Valley, or they want to engage around policy questions, or they want to engage around whatever kind of technology, AI, next frontier conversation it is, or most of them literally only come to take, they don't come to bring, they come to learn. And so something we've really had to be very careful about, again, 15 years of doing that have led to a fatigue in our network where people are just like, and I'm telling you this as someone who has now become a destination. We have this very magnificent space now. Switzerland has become a place that other countries want to see. Oh, what is Switzerland doing there? This is amazing. And they have the gallery, and they have huge event space, 75 people, blah, blah, blah. And we could just do that, right? So we have had to become very streamlined and start to offer programs. So today we are trying to be proactive versus reactive. We try to establish tracks and programs that we communicate to all kinds of stakeholders, whether they're governmental or private. And we try to build those tracks or learning journeys or innovation exchanges around those topics, trying to bring them together. And the very interesting thing we see happening is that this is sort of the way of how you bring these diverse actors together to talk to each other, even though they sit next to each other back in our capital. They actually do not talk to each other there.
That's very
and then
familiar.
suddenly they're abroad and they're like, oh my God, yeah, we have something in common. You're also working on that. And we're like, guys, you didn't have to come to San Francisco to find out. It just so happens that they do come to San Francisco to find out and actually start collaborating. So we've had to become smart at what was to us a reaction to a local context, ended up providing some solutions to at the back end, because suddenly we've been able to facilitate conversations between actors that just don't talk to each other when they're sitting next to each other in departments and offices, because there's a lot of silos thinking, as you probably know very well. Thank you, Joy. Yes, please.
Can I just touch
Yes.
on that a little bit? You're not alone with that problem. So we have spoken to a lot of countries, as I said, and the amount and the breadth of the issues which are being dealt with in Silicon Valley by the companies is immense. What we've seen happening, though, on one side is the diplomats working with the tech companies start to specialize, because they cannot keep up with all the developments in all the spheres. We have diplomats now working in AI, we have diplomats working only in IoT or data protection, and on the other end, also the other governmental officials need to specialize as well. So they specialize within their work on the relationships with the tech companies. So it's both ways. And what we also heard a lot of times is the lack of capacity, that all of the innovation centers, all of the consulates do not have enough staff which is knowledgeable enough on both diplomatic side and technical side to do this. So there is a lot of struggle and a lot of working on education of people and trying to find the right people to do this job as well.